Hello everyone, and welcome to Emotional Grit, the podcast where you can learn about the power of perspective and the science that fuels us. I'm your host, Jennifer Fernjack, and I'm incredibly grateful to share today that my guest is speech pathologist Bri Morbitzer. Bri is a speech language pathologist in St. Paul, Minnesota, where she owns and operates Superior Speech Therapy. Her professional forte is working alongside clients of all ages who stutter and their families. She is the founder and facilitator of the Minneapolis-St. Paul Stuttering Group, which is a social conversation group for adults who stutter in the Twin Cities and the area and beyond. Bree is also a facilitator for Friends conferences and an advisor to the Minnesota Department of Health regarding speech language pathology and audiology. So with all that being said, please feel free to like and subscribe to the podcast on the YouTube channel, Emotional Grit. And I also want to thank Bree for being here today. So thanks, Bree, for being here.
You're welcome.
Much appreciated. So I just want to start out by saying how this topic came up for the podcast and how it came up when I was writing my book. As you can imagine, writing my book about emotional grit, there are a lot of things that came up as far as challenges people face, whether it's health scares or job stress or relationship issues or different things in life. And kind of just learning, well, what are the resources that are out there for people and what are stories of resilience that can inspire people? And of course, behind that and behind the scenes, the science of what fuels us. I mean, it's interesting to think about how we're wired. So that being said, when I was writing my book, I was talking to my friend Katie, and she mentioned there was a guy that she went to high school with who stuttered, but he wouldn't stutter when he was singing. And he also wouldn't stutter in their German class when he was speaking the foreign language, of German. And then on top of that, he wouldn't stutter when he would recite lines for their play. And as she was sharing all this, I thought, wow, that's really fascinating. It's almost like the secrets of the brain, so to speak, and how we're wired. And it made me wonder how that works. And in tandem with that conversation, I thought about the movie that I saw back in 2010 called The King's Speech with Colin Firth, and how in the movie he plays the King of England, where he had to actually, in front of the whole country, or probably the UK for that matter, because it was with the onset of World War II and England joining, where he had to give messages of hope to people over the radio and try not to stutter. So in the movie, real life story, it talks about how, again, when he would sing, he wouldn't stutter either. So all that being said, I'm just wondering, even just starting with singing, what is it about how we're wired and how the brain works that helps people who stutter not do so when they sing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And a lot of the connections that you made in a casual conversation with a friend, then in popular culture, like watching movies and seeing, you know, the movie itself is talking about stuttering. But as we go along digging into movies, we also find out that a lot of actors stutter. And then we get curious what you're asking about. Why aren't they stuttering when they're acting or
Yes.
singing or speaking another language? And all of the things you mentioned are very common. And I wonder a lot about how comfortable someone is, if they feel like they have a chance to speak with a different part of themselves, especially when that comes through in acting. The neuron connections used for singing. It's a little different pathway. It's a different cadence and rhythm. There's more creativity, more of the right
Yeah.
side of the brain is used for something in a creative art like singing, acting, developing a character and being the character. So as
That's
you
interesting.
know, the brain is neuroplastic. It's always changing and evolving. And I think when we ask the brain to step out of the path of speaking, the path that you grew up speaking, you might step out of that stuttered path and you might come into a path that maybe has more flow or less resistance, however you want to look at it.
Exactly. So like when you mentioned the neural pathways of the brain, it makes me think of neuroplasticity, which is
Mhm.
something that a lot of people aren't familiar with, but it's interesting nonetheless. Could you describe that a little bit for people as far as like what some examples are of how that works?
What it means is that research is showing that, or research has showed, that the brain is malleable. You
Mhm.
can make new connections, connections that previously fired together don't have to always stay that way. So this is really encouraging for a lot of people in relation to an injury or accident, but also in relation to trauma or just an experience that was unpleasant, because your brain takes you back to the unpleasantness. You might be aware of it or not, but there might be something about the way the person looks or the way the environment around you sounds. And it takes you to a place where you've been on that pathway before, which can completely impact the way that your body and brain go to coordinate the message. So there's hope, because neuroplasticity means that you can rewire and you can use methodical practices, or you could simply start to stop avoiding also too, to be okay with discomfort
Yeah.
and then move into a new area, a new use, a new pathway. Mhm.
Well, I know I've heard stories of neuroplasticity where somebody has something happen, like maybe they have a stroke or something happens to their brain. And this isn't for everything, but for some things with the brain, such as certain types of strokes, a different part of the brain then takes over the activity that you used to use a different part of the brain for. And now you can do it, but in a different way. It's
Yeah,
really
from my
interesting.
understanding about strokes is there is that exact spot on the brain where the stroke occurs. A variety of things can be impacted depending on where that exact location of the injury is.
Mm.
That part of the brain would be dead. So the neurons then move around it. They figure out a new way to move around the area and keep on going, which isn't that just like a fun way to think about the human spirit? You know, we all
Yes.
want to just keep on going, where we want to be resilient and we want to be, we want to go back to the part where we feel our truest selves, we feel most ourselves. Mhm.
Oh, yeah. I know in my book, when I wrote about neuroplasticity, I wrote about it from a mindset perspective.
Mm.
So, for example, I knew that with my brain tumor scare, I couldn't not experience it. So I had to figure out the how. And sometimes it was adapting to a new normal. Other times it was just trying to persevere and use a lot of patience and try to reframe things so they were a little bit more positive in different situations. But I know one conversation in particular that I wrote about was where I was maybe a few days away from surgery, and I'm in downtown Minneapolis. And yeah, I wasn't sure what was going to happen during the surgery. I mean, I had been warned that going in, I might not come out, so it was just kind of the uncertainty of the unknown, ahead of time. So I remember I was in this elevator in downtown Minneapolis, and this guy got in behind me, and he goes, "Could I say something to you without coming across weird?" And I said, "Sure," And he goes, "You have really beautiful hair." And I said, "Well, thank you." And then I turned around to watch the numbers on the elevator light up as we went up the floors. And he's behind me and he goes, "Oh, it's supposed to rain today." And I said, "Well," I said, "that'll make the grass green." And he said, "Well, yeah, but then I'll have to mow it." And I said, "Well, it's good exercise." And he starts laughing and he goes, "I'm not going to win this conversation, am I?" And I went, "Nope." And I was getting out of the elevator. And I couldn't tell you what this guy looks like if I was to come across him today. But that feeling of that mindset and just kind of the way that it made me kind of frame things played a huge role in my overall experience. And
Mhm.
what initially took kind of some effort in terms of trying to be positive about things, after a while became more of a mindset and then a habit. And I got in the habit of trying to flip the script. So,
Mm.
so for example, it was more like a natural thing that would just happen. So I know there were other times when people would say to me, "Well, Jen, I don't get it. How can you be so positive?" Almost like, "Are you in denial or well, what's the deal?" And I was like, "Well, no, I'm not in denial. I'm aware of the risks with the surgery and what have you. But at the same time, too, I wanted to have a voice in my experience, and that voice gave me a perceived sense of control."
Mhm.
So someone at one point said to me, "Well, Jen, what would you say if someone said to you that 10,000 people each year die from your kind of brain tumor?" And of course, I would feel bad for those people. But as far as how it affects me, I would think, well, is that 10,000 out of 10,000 or is that 10,000 out of a million? Like, give me the context. That's just kind of how my brain works. But I try to be positive and look at the glass as half full. So the neuroplasticity, though, of different mindsets where it's taking some effort initially and after a while becoming kind of a habit or a mindset is a pretty amazing thing.
It
Really,
really
really cool. So
The
So,
story you provided is really, really perfect too, because how we move from thing to thing really matters. And a person who stutters finds a difference pretty easily because we cannot control what the other person is going to say, how much time they have or don't have. Like, we don't know how they're going to react. And I'm not a
mhm,
person who stutters, so I want to, be upfront and say that outright, that really I've learned so much by observing and participating and coming alongside of people of all ages. And I run a stuttering group, a social
mhm,
conversation group, and I've done that for almost 5 years now,
okay,
over 5 years. And
cool.
I have learned such valuable information on hearing their experiences and holding a space where people who stutter can talk really openly,
Mhm.
because sometimes it's not easy to be in the mindset we'd prefer to be in, because sometimes communicating is just plain hard.
Mhm. And having to be in certain environments, whether it's school or a job or playing with neighborhood kids or whatever, where people can be mean.
Yeah,
It's people who don't understand that someone's not stuttering on purpose.
right.
It's something where it's like cut them some slack, and have some empathy, and people just don't realize that. And so
Yeah.
I know, as part of my research, I read that the actor James Earl Jones, who's known as the voice of Darth Vader, so he's very famous for his voice. He also did voiceover work in the Field of Dreams movie that's pretty impactful. But here, this actor who's known for his voice was known to stutter as a child, and just kind of the anxiety that presented for him, and just the challenges that came with it, and how he had to, work through those things and then pursue his passion, in terms of acting. And I also read that about Julia Roberts, how she was known to stutter, growing up, and went on to become an Oscar-winning actress, and just different ways that she had to try to overcome different things, and learn different techniques. But I'm also wondering, just based on stories that I've read about or heard about, why is it that people who stutter don't tend to do so if they're by themselves? And like, for example, I heard about someone who has a daughter who stutters, but when her daughter was playing with her Barbies, like, she was in her room and she thought she was by herself, she was making the Barbies talk to each other. And the mom was listening and noticed that she wasn't stuttering when she thought she was by herself, and no one was listening to her play with her Barbies. So, like, do you know what's kind of behind that?
My clinical experience leads me to believe that it has a lot to do in that scenario with comfort. If
Mm,
she feels completely comfortable, or her audience, her listeners are completely accepting and receptive,
yeah,
which, if you're playing with your favorite toys, why wouldn't they be?
there
That's
you
also
go.
about when people talk to their pets. And there's a children's book called A Boy and a Jaguar. And it's a picture book, and it talks about what you described very closely about a boy stuttering, and when he's at home, closing the door and talking to his pets, the little pets that he can keep in his room, or how he can whisper to a jaguar at the Bronx Zoo, how he doesn't
Oh,
stutter in those moments.
mm-hmm,
And the book talks about his parents wanting to help and bringing him to lots of different therapies and trying lots of different modalities in that way, and nothing seems to work. And how the boy ends up being some kind of researcher with jaguars, and how he appreciates the solitude, and
oh,
he appreciates that part where things just feel easy. The book is really good, but it tells something similar to what you're saying, is how comfortable are kids?
mm-hmm,
And how much do we anticipate risk, and that causes our behavior internally to freeze up? Do we go to a fight flight response as soon
mm,
as we know a person who stutters realizes that the person who's listening to me does not have time to stick around for all that I want to say?
right,
Or,
right.
this is really rushed. We're at a drive through. We're ordering at a coffee shop, and there's a lot of people behind me. And how the person who stutters can instantly maybe be reminded of something unpleasant in the past that's happened,
Yeah.
or finds themselves in the sympathetic nervous system firing on fight, flight response, and they end up ordering something they didn't even want to drink, but they said it because they could say it without stuttering.
Mm. I never thought about that. That's an interesting point. Well, and I know with pets that that at least before the pandemic, and I'm hoping even after the pandemic, there are libraries here in Hennepin County, so in Minneapolis and different suburbs, where volunteers will bring their pets to the library so that little kids who either have some kind of a speech impediment or perhaps they're shy will come read to the rabbit or read to the dog or read to the, hamster or whatever it is, because of the fact that, to your point, I mean, first of all, the animal's not going to be laughing at them, isn't going to be criticizing them. And from also with pets, from some of the research I did for my book, they can also help lower stress hormones. It's that's also why different institutions, including hospitals now, will allow pets to come around and visit people during their times of need. So
Yeah.
it's pretty amazing. But I do have a letter that I want to read for listeners. I'm going to go ahead and pull it up on my phone here. When I was doing research for the podcast here, I was looking up public figures who stutter or stuttered, and just kind of the resilience they had and how they got through it, and different ways they've tackled it. And one person who I came across is Tiger Woods, and he has talked about how he grew up stuttering and just kind of his competitive nature as far as when it applies to sports, also applied to trying to get through the stuttering and get past it. And so, but he has complete empathy for anybody who stutters and just kind of, again, the challenges that come with that from a psychological perspective, an emotional perspective, the physicality of it, and of course the social aspects as well. So when he found out that there was a fan of his who stuttered, he wanted to let that person know that, hey, you know what? I have empathy for what you're going through, and I really admire the courage that you have. So I have a copy of the letter here because it was published from Tiger. It reads, "Dear Dylan, someone told me that you like watching me play golf. I really appreciate that, and I also want to say how proud I am of you. I know what it's like to be different and to sometimes not fit in. I also stuttered as a child, and I would talk to my dog as he would sit there and listen until he fell asleep. I also took a class for 2 years to help me, and I finally learned to stop. I was younger than most kids I competed against, and often I was the only minority player in the field. But I didn't let that stop me, and I think it even inspired me to work harder. I know you can do that too. You have a great family and big fans like me on your side. Be well and keep fighting. I'm certain you'll do great things with anything you do. Tiger." And I thought, how great, for a public figure like him to
Mhm.
share and be very transparent with people about what he experienced so that others can take comfort and learn from it. It's pretty amazing, you
It
know?
is. And a couple other examples that come to mind right now are Ed Sheeran
Hmm.
and Emily Blunt. She's a
Hmm.
very prominent voice, literally, for people who stutter. She works closely with the American Institute for Stuttering. I believe she's on their board. And also, she is also doing a lot of public engagements for them. And then um, President Joe Biden, he
Oh, good
stutters.
point. Hmm.
And it doesn't come up quite a lot that he does stutter, but he has been really outwardly and publicly kind to a young man named Braden, and who he allowed then to speak before he spoke at, I can't remember exactly which convention it was, but for this young
Wow.
Braden, he said that he would not be where he was without knowing that Joe Biden himself stuttered. And that was very important. And, I do see a lot of students who stutter end up creating projects about stuttering. They really we all want to be understood,
Oh, yeah.
but students especially really want their classmates to understand. And
Hmm.
listing celebrities becomes normalizing, listing prevalence and, what it is, what we're aware of. Maybe it isn't as scary. Maybe it still is pretty scary. But what we're aware of, we really do have the power to change. And thanks to our point about neuroplasticity, thanks to our point about our attitude and our emotions around the thing, it's really important that anyone who seeks therapy for stuttering is affirmed in their
Yes.
stutter. because it
Yes.
might not be something that can be overcome. Someone might stutter their whole life, even though they have therapy with maybe an excellent therapist. And that's why the therapy itself should really focus on some really competent communication, some very effective communication that's authentic to them, that sounds like them, that they aren't holding back anything that they wish they would have said. And it's important that the speech therapist can be someone that affirms stuttering, because they might always stutter. And that's to be
Right.
said too
Right.
about parents and family, is there shouldn't ever be some kind of attitude of like, well, it'll go away, or
And being
well,
dismissive.
yeah, because
Mhm.
stuttering is a part, and it does feel, I I don't know, but it feels like the person is wrong if stuttering is wrong.
Right.
And really, when we all think about it, is it actually wrong to stutter? I don't think so.
That's a very interesting point.
Yeah, and I am very curious, why don't more people stutter?
I never thought about that before.
There's so much there's so much complexity
Mhm.
when someone thinks of the message they want to say, they
Mhm.
formulate it, they might be able to just start talking and they find it along the way, and their mouth is in the right spot, and their vocal cords are doing all the right things, and their breath is leading them along. Why don't people stutter more? Because really, stuttering is just the talking, the sound kept going, and it wasn't meant to keep going. That's a repetition, of course.
Right.
Or
Right.
the sound just stops, and there's a silence, and there's, a struggle, and that's called a block. Really, the voice just stops, and we didn't intend for the voice to stop, or the voice just kept going, and we didn't intend for it to keep going.
Man, this is really fascinating,
Mhm.
So it's just and it's also interesting to think about, again, circling back to the psychology of it and the social aspects, that it goes beyond the stutter, and that certain people don't know how to react to it. So they might try to finish the sentence for the person, or, and it's like, well, maybe the person doesn't want you to, So it's, what are some best practices for people if they are around someone who's stuttering, whether it be a young child, or an adult for that matter? Like, what's kind of what are some options as far as how you can respond?
Mhm. Yeah, you're right that not everyone really would know what's happening in the moment if they heard the other person's speech stop or keep going. There's so much uncertainty. And then in that moment, people want to help usually.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're right that they might make a small joke to kind of lighten any tension that they themselves are
Mhm.
experiencing or that they feel. So the best thing I think to do is to just simply be okay with the stutter, to
Yeah.
be okay in the moment, allow it to happen, allow it to be there, because it is, we can choose to fight or cringe, or we can choose to be here in this moment comfortably, or
Yeah.
choose
Yeah.
to just be patient and wait for it to pass. I had a young girl say that to me who stutters, one of my clients. She said that she notices the moment sometimes when she is stuttering, and she simply waits for it to pass. And I think that that's
Interesting.
wise on her part and intuitive on her part.
Yeah. So, because I never thought about the idea of waiting for it to pass. Is it something where it's that the person's just becoming more comfortable in the moment, so they know that if they become more comfortable, that they'll be more apt to get through it and be able to say what they want to say?
Yeah, perhaps two things are happening because conversations are two or more people. It could be that they know that the other person has time for whatever they have to say.
True.
And that relays a message more than just hearing what someone's going to say. It relays a message as, I'm here for it. I'm here for you. What you are saying matters right now, and I won't leave. Same to go for the person who stutters themselves, is will they stay there in that moment? And another piece of advice for what to do if you're talking with someone who stutters is to keep your eye contact with their eyes. Body
Okay.
language speaks a lot to how someone's feeling. And a lot of people who struggle with stuttering oftentimes look away in the moment of stuttering because the body is trying to get out of the discomfort.
Right.
I
Right.
noticed that I started working with an adult man, and I noticed that every time I met with him, his body posture was turned completely away from me. His legs, shoulders were faced in the chair the other way for more than one of our conversations. But he would turn his head to look. But I don't know if he was aware or not, but his body perhaps knew
Hmm.
that it was more comfortable to be away,
Yeah.
to turn his head and engage with me with his eyes when he thought that he could, or when it felt comfortable to do so.
That's interesting because it makes you wonder if it was a subconscious thing or a conscious thing, as far as the body being turned like that, you
I
know?
I asked him about it after we had built some rapport, and he said he didn't realize he did it almost always.
Okay.
So
Wow.
I think we know that the body always wants to be comfortable.
True.
So we make little adjustments, we cross our legs uncrossed, we take a drink of water because we're finding comfort. And the
Right.
moment of stuttering can be really uncomfortable for a lot of people. Now, some people, their attitude, their emotions around the stuttering moment can be different. They can get comfortable and be present in that moment and accept that this is happening right now. And things usually go smooth. It's kind of like one of those finger traps
Yeah.
where you stick your fingers in both ends, and if you really pull, you're stuck. If you really fight it, you're stuck. So there's
Right.
something to be said about how you're willing to move from sound to sound, a stuck sound, and a part of the word where the person is stuck to the next part. Could you move to the next sound with less tension and kind of release that finger trap and then get going to the rest of what you're going to say? So there are specific strategies and techniques that someone who stutters really can employ if they want to. But something important is being okay with stuttering, whether it's going to happen or not.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, I know when I was doing research for the episode tonight and looking up different public figures again, as far as stuttering situations, I learned that Elvis stuttered and how when he was on stage in front of people between songs, so he's not singing, but between songs, he would sometimes change words in the moment if he caught himself beginning to stutter. So there were certain different things. I think it was the letter I and then maybe a th, but different things he knew were going to be issues for him. So in that moment, he would pivot on stage as far as changing what word he would use, and then just keep on going. Keep on
Right.
going, and uh, and of course, I mean, in addition to singing, he was also an actor. So there were times when he was trying to say his lines, be it a monologue or a dialogue or whatever was going on, and he learned to pivot. So it was interesting how he could take what was happening, and rather than having it keep him from pursuing his passion or honing his craft, he figured out different ways to try to
Mhm.
get through things and still go on. But I know that circling back to the singer Ed Sheeran, I read about how when he was little, he had what's called a port wine stain, which is like a birthmark on his face, and he had different laser treatments to burn it off. Well, during one of the treatments, they forgot to give him the anesthesia or whatever the medication was to keep it from him actually feeling the laser burning his face. And he thinks that may have caused nerve damage. But
Mm.
ever since then, as a kid, he began to stutter. And so, of course, kids at school were mean, and there were just it was one of the challenges that he had to work through as a child. But then it was once he was given the Eminem record and he fell in love with it. And Eminem isn't a singer. I mean, Eminem's a rapper, so he's talking, but it's to a different cadence than maybe what Ed was used to. He was able to actually emulate what Eminem did and start rapping himself, and was able
Mhm.
to work through the stutter. And so I'm curious as to how that works too, because Ed Sheeran's from Europe. I forget if it is it Scotland or Ireland. I forget which country he's from, but he's from overseas, and so obviously he'd be speaking with a different accent growing up than what we would have. But then rapping, it was a totally different thing. So I'm guessing
Right.
it's kind of what you and I talked about earlier, where perhaps it's a different part of the brain, or how is it that that would work?
A different part of the brain is likely a different pull from the creative side of the brain, and finding a different cadence of speaking. You know, singing and rapping allows the voice to stay a little more connected
Hmm.
from word to word. So I believe the transition from sound to sound or word to word becomes a little easier, or has a little more of a smooth way forward. There's actually a method of teaching, or a therapy tactic or tool, if you would say, called connected speech, which means that the client is asked, and the clinician would model keeping the voice sounding like it's turned on, so that the voice kind of stays active, or you might stay in a flow. For me, in my clinical work, I do take that concept, and I think it's um, more authentic to the client to think about just the transition from sound to sound or word to word,
Hmm.
and to be able to move forward with a little more grace, or just knowing what you want to do next and head toward that with a little more mindfulness of that moment and that shift.
Hmm.
Because
Wow.
it's important to me as a therapist that someone sounds like the way they want to sound, and
Hmm.
hopefully the person is affirmed enough in their identity where they want to sound like themselves, and they
Yeah.
don't want to sound like they're speaking slowly. A lot of people say, oh, just slow down, but really we wouldn't actually want to sound slow in speech, because it wouldn't sound natural to the person, or it might not
Right.
convey
Right.
their excitement or convey their tone well. So really, I think it's important to be easy and relaxed as we speak, and ask the client in those moments of stuckness, could you think about reducing a little tension if you feel like you're stuck open? Elvis, you mentioned, maybe had the sound or the letter I, so perhaps his mouth was open. Could
Could
he
be.
reduce some of that tension and keep going forward?
Oh
When
yeah, absolutely.
when
I
people
also,
switch words like that, it could be a sign of covert stuttering, which means that a person has figured out what sounds or what words they're going to stutter on, and they can switch when they can tell it's going to happen, just like you
um,
described about
yeah.
Elvis. And sometimes people just know that there's words that are difficult to say, and they go ahead and just don't say them. And the danger
Yeah.
with that is that it might not be really a true reflection of yourself. And that might really get a person down if they never really say
That's true.
the town that they're from, because that's important. Or if they never really say their spouse's name and they wanted to.
Oh yeah, I
The
could see
example
that.
of, yeah, the example of a coffee shop is, what if they couldn't really say what they actually wanted to order, and they've been drinking something they don't really want to drink? So covert stuttering can be really dangerous, or like a slippery slope in that expression, because once you get used to the idea of not saying what you want to say and subbing it out for something else, you might
Yeah,
find yourself
that's
not
interesting.
really being yourself.
Yeah, that's true. Which brings on a whole other host of issues, beyond the speaking itself. So
Mhm.
I also find it very fascinating that when you hear people from other countries sing, like my prior episode to this one, I talked about Beatlemania and just kind of how Beatlemania, the songs of the Beatles actually affected people physically. Like as far as how when people when fans would faint or cry or scream or whatever, it was the body's fight or flight response system and how it could affect your tear ducts and what have you. So it was an interesting episode. But like what I find interesting is that when the Beatles would sing, I wouldn't hear their British accents, So I'm like, that's fascinating. But then it makes me wonder then if they heard their own music, did they think they sounded like us? I don't know.
Yeah,
Or
or
I don't know.
perhaps they
That's
just accepted that as their singing voice versus their
yeah.
speaking conversation voice.
Could be. And I'm also wondering if somebody speaks more than one language, are they more apt to stutter in their primary language, but not the second language? Or how does that, or would it be both languages?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked that because a lot of parents of kids who stutter ask because there's this little question in the back of their heads of like, should we have them stop speaking both? Should they just come to only one language? So the short answer is the child or the person does not have to and even should not stop speaking two or more languages. Stuttering is likely to occur in both of the languages, and it can be different between the language that is more proficient.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be different with the language that's more conversational and the language that's more academic. Now, there's a couple different thoughts there because someone in my Minneapolis St. Paul stuttering group describes a time that he did have to speak out loud in his German class to prove his competency for assignments. And because of the pressure, he stuttered more. And it was hard to
Interesting.
decipher if it was because it was German, if was because it was a new language to him, if it was because there were lots of people listening to him only speak in front of the class and it was being recorded, or a combination of those things.
Right. Well, and then you have my friend Katie's classmate that I mentioned at the beginning of our podcast, who the person who didn't stutter when he would sing or recite lines for their play, or when he was in his own German class, he wouldn't stutter. So I don't know if it was because he was maybe using a German accent, like joking around with English words, or if he was trying to speak the German language, but in his situation, he didn't. So it's really interesting how it may be somewhat contingent on the person or to your point, the situation. Are you under pressure or not?
Mhm.
Different things like that. I've also noticed that with the research I did that, or at least it's my understanding, that boys are more apt to stutter than girls. Is that your
Mhm.
understanding as well? And I'm wondering why that is.
Yeah, it is true. I believe the last time I was informed of the research, it's about a 4-to-1 ratio for boys would stutter to every one girl.
Okay.
And stuttering, to your point about complexity and
Mhm.
being contingent on the person, I wonder about the male brain developing, the female brain developing, because stuttering in a developing brain, under the age of 5 is very common. A lot of parents recognize their child is repeating, they seem rushed, their speech sounds bumpy. Is it really
Mhm.
stuttering? But the research is pointing to physical and chemical differences in the brain of a person who stutters and in the brain of a person who does not stutter.
Okay.
I think now, I don't know this, but I think that the more research is done, perhaps that will start to shed some light on why exactly there
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
more prevalence among males if I don't already, if it doesn't already exist. But you're
Yeah.
right about that. And stuttering is really common under 5. And a lot of parents see their doctor about it, and their doctor usually advises them to kind of wait and see if it resolves because oftentimes it really does resolve. About 60% of the time, it just resolves on its own, or maybe even more. I could be wrong about that.
Okay.
Um, but there's so much happening in the brain under the age
Hmm.
of 5.
That's what I'm saying. There's so many secrets that the brain keeps. You know what I mean? Like things that
Yeah.
we just can't see. It's just fascinating, But um, so from my research, I noted that there are three different types of stuttering. That there's developmental, neurogenetic, and psychogenetic. Can you explain some of the differences between the types in layman's terms for people
Sure.
as far as what that means?
Sure. Well, starting at the beginning, speech language pathologists are involved with stuttering because it is a disorder that affects the way that someone speaks. The vocal folds stay open, the articulators, like the tongue, will stay in its position or repeat in its position. The same is said about the vocal cords and like the position and placement of things in the mouth, but also, you know, what else is going on beyond that speaks to all of these different ways that a child is growing up developing, the language and the talking really takes off, somewhere between the age of 2, 3 to 4 and 5. And that would be an example of developmental stuttering, and it can resolve on its own. One of the key things to notice is I do wish more physicians would ask a little deeper of how long it's been happening, because stuttering beyond 6 months does cause concern for me, and I think a lot of other clinicians, that does seem like it's persisted for quite a while. And in fact, the recovery rate for a child to not stutter would be 63% after the child's been stuttering for a year. But if the
Okay.
child's been stuttering for 2 years, it drops to 47%. And if the child's been stuttering for 3 years, on and off, the
Yeah,
recovery
yeah.
already down to 16%. So we're talking about, a parent thinking like, yeah, they started stuttering around the age of 2 and they're 5 and they're getting help and their speech therapy at school, and that's all helpful. But sometimes the pathway of speaking really just has a lot of disfluency involved in it for whatever right reason,
Yeah.
developmental reasons,
Yeah.
like growing up and adjusting the brain to remember all of the ways that we speak and the
Mhm.
order in which the words go and how to make the sounds that are involved in each word. There's a huge demand. So it's understandable that there's a lot of that it's most commonly thought of developmental stuttering, because that's kind of what we think about a lot. But you see stuttering in adults, perhaps because of an emotional response to trauma or just an emotional heightenedness. There's also a lot of other things like disorders or challenges that might be involved for a person who stutter that have a lot to do with the executive functions. So, difficulty planning, organizing, um, difficulty inhibiting a thought or attending. And when the brain has a lot of different places that it is, because it's trying to coordinate everything and plan what they're going to say and inhibit the distractions all around them, or just inhibit a distracting thought that they're having, we might see some stuttering in an adult just because of some other things that are going on for them also.
Right.
Mhm.
So with neurogenetic stuttering, is that a little bit different? Or the psychogenetic as well?
Yeah, and it should be said too that there is strong research that stuttering can be genetic too. It can run in families. There could be a family
Okay.
member that people can point to. A lot of times people don't know also, because sometimes people hide their stuttering or have figured out how to
Mm.
not stutter, and maybe they weren't even aware that they were stuttering.
Right, right, right.
But there are
Mm.
things that happen, throughout life, like physical traumas. I know that there's a very popular comedian named Drew Lynch who started stuttering after he was hit in the throat with a softball.
Oh,
So,
that's
mhm,
interesting.
and so there's some nerve involvement there. And if someone's
Yeah.
struggling with really heavy PTSD and a lot of other things that just kind of make the neurological system quite alarmed,
Yeah.
it's also possible that stuttering can happen in adulthood. Mhm.
Wow. Are there any resources out there that you can point people to? I mean, obviously, I know you can Google stuff, but are there any particular websites or books or
Mm.
anything that people could go to?
Well, for children, asking a doctor about it is a good start, because a doctor can refer to a speech therapist if they think it's necessary. Also, just understanding risk factors, like noticing if your child really has stuttered for quite some time, if it's kind of come and gone, that might be a sign that stuttering doesn't present itself when things are kind of just flowing and easy for a child. But when there's a big transition, a lot of learning happening, a lot of newness happening, a lot of excitement, holiday seasons, and changes in the household, a lot of those reasons could be showing some stuttering for the child, because it's stress. It's good stress sometimes to have them the holidays, but it's still stress.
Right, right,
So
right.
just kind of understanding a little bit more and not being afraid to ask a doctor or a speech pathologist, do you think my child should be seen? Because
Mm-hmm.
early childhood, under the age of 4, a lot of treatments are highly effective
Cool.
if the child is seen right away, which speaks to the developing brain. There's the American Institute for Stuttering. There's the Stuttering Foundations as some really big organizations that are educators of stuttering and good resources. There's a lot of great podcasts. One of them is called Stutter Talk.
Okay.
Another one is the Stuttering Foundation itself really does have a podcast about with the content of stuttering. There's recently a great movie called When I Stutter,
Okay.
which would be more for adults, the parents or the adult who stutters themselves. But like I said earlier, there's a lot to be said about communication competence.
Mm.
And that gets tricky about finding a good therapist is some therapists don't see a lot of stuttering. So when they do see a child or person who stutters, they might just want to get going on some tools, but they might find that for the client, they don't really use the tools.
Uh,
And
okay.
so I think it's important to talk about the child's identity, affirming who they are, praising all that the child and the adult, their skills, their talents, really knowing themselves, because stuttering might be a part of them, but it doesn't have to be the thing that everyone knows about
Absolutely. But and you know what? I appreciate all the different resources you've referenced. But I'm a little bit disappointed because you were supposed to say that everybody should buy an Eminem record and start rapping.
them.
Because I love rap music. But yeah,
Yeah.
no, no, in all seriousness, I appreciate everything that you've mentioned. Anything you want to close with as far as like points we haven't discussed or anything you wanted to share for people?
Hmm.
Or do we kind of touch on the different bases that you wanted to?
Well, I think that part of stuttering now, or more modern stuttering therapy, is affirming stuttering.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also including more mindfulness, more breath work, because there's a ton of power in the present moment and being right here. Because right here is really the only thing that you know for certain. And it's very easy to get caught in the anxiety of what could happen and what has happened. So, for the most ease in communication, it's really important to stay in the present moment, which is breath work, which is mindfulness. And I'm really happy to know that a lot of schools are employing that in their classrooms. And I
Good.
think it's important for people who stutter to know, or um, really any neurodiversity, because the practice of the breath, extending your exhale, really does calm the nervous system. It really does move you, the brain, yourself, off of the sympathetic and onto the parasympathetic. And when the nervous system is more regulated, there is more flow, or
That's
you at
interesting.
least are more comfortable.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad to see too that people are seeing the importance of sensory regulation in
Hmm.
therapy. I'm really glad to see that therapy right now is also considering the other things like ADHD, anxiety, learning disorders, reading disorders. All of those things might be happening in the person who stutters, which is so important to know. And I hope a lot of speech therapists don't dismiss those things because they're not actually speech, but they contribute to the stress and strain that's put on the person who stutters.
I could see that.
Mhm.
Definitely.
And then
Well,
another thing to mention that I appreciate is I think a lot of people who stutter and therapists and researchers are starting to realize that there is an impact of trauma, or at least like kind of small perceptions of trauma, because we want, a trauma event does spike the fight flight response on the sympathetic nervous system. So if a person who stutters is kind of in that stress response a lot, I wonder a lot about how we might deal with or incorporate trauma treatment in stuttering and get
Oh,
a little more wise about where this intersection is for the person. And a really great book that is really recent is called Every Waking Moment, and it's written by
okay.
Christopher Anderson.
Okay.
And he is a person who stutters, and he talks a lot about his complete journey, but also the relationship of avoiding. We talked about Elvis and shifting words or avoiding words, but the things we avoid become accessible to enter into. And he participated in an avoidance reduction therapy program. And I am not trained at it myself, but I can completely understand why he and a lot of people find a lot of success in dealing with the response to avoid and instead having a little more agency, just little by little, just being more comfortable with the discomfort or
Right.
reducing, resisting some time pressure. Mhm.
Again, all great points. Things I wouldn't have thought about before, but it all makes complete sense. So it's one thing to get knowledge from reading. Like I did research obviously on this podcast by Googling a lot of things, but you have the wisdom that comes from your profession. And I think wisdom can be different from knowledge, And so I really appreciate just what you do, what you've done, what you will continue to do. So thank you for people who are stuttering or used to stutter but get nervous that they'll do it again, or perhaps their family members who are taking care of them. Just thank you for everything
Yeah.
and for being here today. I appreciate it. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and close things out. So for all the listeners, thank you so much for joining us. And again, please feel free to like and subscribe to the podcast on my YouTube channel called Emotional Grit for more information as well. And have a great day. Thank you. And thanks, Bri.